The husband suddenly died when I was in the 4th month. The mother-in-law screamed, "Get rid of him and get out." But the doctor, after examining me, said, "Don't give up the child. Come, I'll introduce you to someone. But before we continue, please tell me where you are from and how old you are. It will be interesting to know who's with me now. Enjoy listening." Regina met Anton in April, when the bird cherry hadn't bloomed yet, but the air already smelled of thawed earth and approaching warmth. He came to Kiev-Sky on business, designing some livestock complexes in the neighboring district, and he ended up in their village by accident, getting lost on the back roads. Regina was just taking the children for a walk when a grey car stopped at the kindergarten fence. A tall man with a confused face got out. "Excuse me, could you tell me how to get to the highway?" he asked, and Regina remembered that his voice was low and muffled, and his eyes were light brown with a squint from the bright spring sun. She explained the way, getting tangled in the names of the turns, and he listened attentively, nodding, and for some reason didn't drive away. The children crowded the fence, staring at the stranger with the curiosity of magpies, and Regina embarrassedly shooed them away. Anton laughed and pulled chocolates from the glove compartment. "You can't," she said strictly. "Parents don't allow sweets from strangers." "Then let's get acquainted," he replied simply. "My name is Anton Rosen, an engineer from Chelyabinsk. Now I'm not a stranger." A week later, he returned, not lost this time, but on purpose. He brought flowers, awkwardly shifted from foot to foot on the porch while Regina handed over her shift to her colleague. Then there were long walks along the Ural River, conversations until dark on the bench by the village club, his hands warm and cautious when he first took her palm in his. Anton spoke about Chelyabinsk with such love that the industrial city with factories and smog turned into a magical place in his stories, where a completely different life awaited her. Regina listened and believed every word because she was 27 years old, because she had never traveled farther than Magnitogorsk, because this mature, confident man looked at her in a way that made her feel like the most important person in the world. "You understand that I won't let you go," he said one evening when they sat by the shore, and a milky fog hung over the water. "Marry me." Regina agreed without a second's hesitation. Anton wanted to have the wedding quickly, at the end of May, before the summer heat and business trips to the sites began. She met her mother-in-law a week before the ceremony. Anton kept putting off this meeting, joking that his mother was a complicated woman and he needed to choose the right moment. Then he confessed he was afraid she might suddenly spoil the mood before the wedding. But they couldn't delay any longer. Invitations had been sent. Regina's parents were already preparing for the arrival. Margarita Stepanovna met her at the door of the very apartment where they were to live after the wedding. Regina was so nervous that her palms were sweating, but her mother-in-law immediately took her by the hand, led her to the kitchen, sat her at a table laden with homemade pastries and jam. "What a pretty one you are," she cooed, pouring tea. "And Tosha told me all about you, but I couldn't imagine he had such taste. Fresh, rosy, a real Russian beauty." "Thank you," Regina murmured, not knowing where to look from embarrassment. "You just don't be shy," Margarita Stepanovna continued, pushing a plate of cottage cheese pies toward her. "Consider me your second mother. And Tosha has everything. You don't have to worry about a thing. Just create coziness in the home, be a good wife. Our family needs exactly that kind of daughter-in-law. Kind, homemaking, without those modern fads of yours." That evening, Regina called her mom and, choking with delight, said, "Mom, she's so wonderful. She bakes everything herself, asked all about us, said she'll definitely get to know you better at the wedding, and in the summer she'll come to Kiev-Sky to try our honey. I'm so lucky with relatives." Her mom on the other end of the line sniffled with happiness. Regina looked out the window at the evening lights of Chelyabinsk and thought that her life was like a fairy tale where everything ends. Well, it couldn't be otherwise. They had the wedding at the end of May, when the air was filled with the scent of blooming lilacs. Her parents cried at the ceremony. Her mom, wiping her eyes with the corner of a handkerchief, kept repeating, "We've waited, we've waited." Her father firmly shook Anton's hand and called him son. They were in their 60s. Their daughter was born late, and all their lives they had dreamed of only one thing: that Regina would find a good man who would take care of her. A city engineer with his own apartment seemed to them a miracle, a gift from fate, a reward for all the years of hard work at the apiary. Margarita Stepanovna was welcoming with the bride's parents, interested in their farm, promised to visit, and Regina thought that this was happiness, when both families got along so easily. After the wedding, they moved to Chelyabinsk. The apartment amazed Regina with its size. 3 rooms, 2 balconies, a view of the park. Anton explained that his mother bought it for them, but it was registered in her name for now. Easier with taxes, they'd transfer it later. Regina didn't delve into the details. 12 million rubles was a sum her family wouldn't earn in 20 years. What difference did it make whose name it was in? Get used to it, Anton laughed, hugging her at the door. This is your home now. She found out about the pregnancy in October, when the leaves on the trees in the park below the windows had already turned yellow and begun to fall. The test showed 2 lines, and Regina stood in the bathroom for several minutes, unable to believe it, pressing the plastic stick to her chest. Anton came home from work late that day, tired, but when she silently handed him the test, his face changed, brightened, rejuvenated, and he suddenly scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around the room, muttering something incoherent and happy. Wait, wait, she laughed, clinging to his shoulders. You'll drop me. Never, he replied seriously, lowering her onto the couch. I'll never drop you. Then he sat beside her, resting his head on her lap, and made plans. To sell the car, about fishing, about how he'd teach his son, definitely a son, to ride a bike. Regina stroked his hair and thought she wanted to remember this moment forever. Margarita Stepanovna took the news with a restrained smile, kissed her daughter-in-law on the cheek, said all the appropriate words, but something in her gaze scratched at Regina, a shadow that flickered and then hid. She attributed it to her mother-in-law's age, to the restraint of that generation not accustomed to splashing emotions. She didn't think about it anymore. In February, Anton had to go to a site in the mountains at tourist base near Dogany needed urgent inspection, and he promised to return in 3 days. Regina packed his bag herself, putting in warm sweaters and a thermos of tea. There's a serpentine there, she said, zipping it up. Be careful on the turns. Don't worry, he hugged her from behind, placing his palms on her rounded belly. I now have someone to come back for. The call came 2 days later, at 10:30 in the morning. Regina was just washing the dishes after breakfast when the phone vibrated in the pocket of her robe. An unfamiliar number, a male voice, official and sympathetic, uttering words she couldn't understand, couldn't let in, couldn't connect to reality. The car plunged off a cliff at the pass. The driver and passenger died on the spot. We offer our condolences. She came to in the hospital, under an 4 drip, with a buzzing emptiness in her head. Next to her sat Margarita Stepanovna, holding her hand and crying real tears that streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto her blouse. Daughter, she whispered, how will we live now? Antosha's gone. How will we live? Regina looked at her and felt something like relief. At least not alone, at least someone nearby who understood her grief, who would share this unbearable burden. She didn't remember how she got to the morgue, how she identified the body, how she signed some papers. Memory mercifully shut off, leaving only fragments. Someone's hands leading her by the elbow, the smell of medicine, the sound of her own voice repeating, yes, it's him. Yes, it's my husband. The funeral passed in a fog. People approached, said something. Regina nodded and heard not a word. Margarita Stepanovna organized everything herself. The coffin, the wake, the wreaths. Regina was grateful to her for that because she herself couldn't think, couldn't act, couldn't even cry. The last mourners left closer to evening. Regina sat in the kitchen, mechanically collecting dirty dishes, when she heard footsteps behind her. Margarita Stepanovna stopped in the doorway, leaning her shoulder against the jamb, and looked at her daughter-in-law silently, motionlessly, with an expression Regina had never seen on her before. Enough pretending to be the grieving widow, said her mother-in-law, and her voice was cold, unfamiliar, alien. Now let's talk frankly. Regina turned, not understanding. Margarita Stepanovna, are you feeling bad? Maybe some water? Water. She sneered, entering the kitchen and sitting at the table. You bumpkin, you thought you could latch onto my son and get away with it? Regina felt the floor slip away from under her feet but forced herself to stand straight. I don't understand what you're talking about. But I do. As soon as he married you, everything fell apart. Projects failed, the bosses nitpicked. You brought misfortune into the house, and here's the result. My Antosha is gone. That's not true, Regina whispered. Anton loved me. We were happy. Happy. Margarita Stepanovna laughed, and that laugh was scarier than a scream. You're nobody, a village girl without education, without connections. I tolerated you for Anton's sake, but is gone now. Keys to the apartment and car on the table. Right now. The days following that conversation merged into one endless nightmare. Regina cleaned the apartment, cooked food for the visitors offering condolences, washed, scrubbed floors, and Margarita Stepanovna sat in an armchair and commanded, pointing out where dust remained, where it wasn't wiped well, where it wasn't scrubbed. At lunch, Regina got the leftovers from the table, and her mother-in-law repeated each time, "Say thank you that I'm feeding you at all. I could throw you out on the street." Regina convinced herself that it was grief, that Margarita Stepanovna had lost her son and couldn't cope with the pain, that she needed to endure, to be there, to support. After all, they both had lost Anton. After all, they both mourned him. She clenched her teeth, swallowed tears, and repeated to herself that she had to be strong for the child's sake. On the 6th day after the funeral, Margarita Stepanovna entered the room where Regina was folding bed linens and threw a wad of money at her feet. The bills scattered across the floor like a fan. 150,000, said her mother-in-law. For the clinic and the ticket to your goat village. Get rid of that burden and go back where you came from, so there's no trace of you here. Regina lifted her eyes, unable to believe what she heard. You want me to get rid of the child? Your grandson? Margarita Stepanovna grimaced in disgust. That's not my grandson, that's a burden I don't need. Anton's gone, why do I need you and this mishap? This is Anton's apartment. I'm his legal wife. I have rights. Rights? Her mother-in-law sneered, stepping toward her, and Regina involuntarily stepped back. The apartment is in my name, you fool. You're nobody here, you don't even have Chelyabinsk registration. Go to court, let's see who'll listen to you. I have connections in this city you couldn't dream of. I've already packed your things, the bag is on the landing. The door slammed shut with a dry click. Regina stood on the landing, clutching an old sports bag with clothes, and couldn't understand where to go. The money was in her pocket, 150,000 rubles for something she would never do. Her parents were in the village, almost 200 kilometers away, and here there were no acquaintances, no job, no housing, no future. Her hand rested on her belly, where lived someone she hadn't seen yet but already loved with all her heart, the last particle of Anton, the last reason not to give up. Regina straightened, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and stepped toward the elevator. The February wind hit her face with fine icy grit when Regina stepped out of the entrance and stopped under the concrete canopy, not knowing where to go next. The sports bag weighed on her shoulder in her jacket pocket was the money so she could terminate the pregnancy, and around her stretched a big city, indifferent to her grief, just as the passers-by hurrying by on their own business were indifferent and didn't notice the young woman with a tear-streaked face and a rounded belly. She stood like that for about 10 minutes, staring at the grey February sky and not feeling the cold, until the icy wind shook off the stupor, and then her legs carried her away from this house, from this yard, from everything that an hour ago had seemed her life. She didn't go to the clinic whose address her mother-in-law had given. Something told her that everything was already arranged there, that they were waiting for her, that she would leave there without the child. That thought caused such animal terror that Regina turned in the opposite direction without even glancing at the slip with the address. Instead, she wandered the streets for several hours until she found herself in some alley on the northwest side of the city, where between residential buildings nestled an unremarkable 2-story building with a sign Medical Center Nadezhda. The name seemed to her a stupid, naive sign, but still a sign, and she pushed the heavy door. Inside it was warm and quiet. The reception was clean and calm, not like in state clinics with their anxious bustle. The registry was empty, chairs stood in neat rows, and Regina was about to leave, deciding the clinic was closed, when from a room deep in the corridor came a man in his 60s, tall, fit, in a white coat over an expensive cashmere sweater, with a neat haircut and glasses in thin gold frames that gave him the look of a university professor. "Can I help you?" he asked, and his voice was soft, sympathetic, and reassuring, so natural that Regina felt the tension in her shoulders ease a bit. I need an ultrasound," she squeezed out, and only then realized tears were streaming down her cheeks, which she didn't even try to wipe. The man didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't inquire if she had an appointment or insurance. He simply led her to the room, sat her on the couch, gave her water in a plastic cup, and waited until she calmed down a little. He introduced himself as Gennady Pavlovich Chernik, a doctor and the owner of this clinic, which he opened 15 years ago, tired of the bureaucracy of large medical centers. He did the ultrasound silently, attentively looking at the screen and moving the probe over her belly with the caution that only very experienced doctors have. Then he turned to her with a smile that made wrinkles fan out around his eyes. A boy, healthy, strong. Heartbeat is good. Development matches the term. Regina covered her face with her hands and sobbed from relief, from grief, from everything at once, from the fact that this stranger spoke to her like a human, not like an annoying fly to be gotten rid of. Gennady Pavlovich waited, not rushing her and not consoling with empty words, and when she calmed down a bit, he began asking strange questions. How long had she known her husband before the wedding? Were there objections from his family? Where did they meet? What did he do for work? Regina answered mechanically, not understanding why a gynecologist needed details of her personal life, but too exhausted to ask or resist. Rusin, you say, he said thoughtfully when she gave Anton's last name, and something flickered in his eyes. A spark, some recognition, but Regina, immersed in her despair, didn't notice it, busy wiping tears and pulling herself together. Then he was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the snow-covered yard, and Regina began to think the conversation was over when Gennady Pavlovich finally turned to her with an expression she couldn't read, serious, almost solemn. Don't do it. Don't get rid of the child. Believe me, just once in your life. I wasn't planning to, Regina whispered, surprised that he even assumed such a thing. But I have nowhere to go. I've been thrown out of the house. Come with me, said Gennady Pavlovich, standing and taking off his coat. I'll introduce you to someone. He'll explain a lot. She should have refused. Going with a stranger in an unknown direction was madness. Any sensible person would tell her to stop and think. But she had nothing left to lose, and Regina nodded, rising from the couch, barely standing on her feet. The cafe was called Tashina and was in the city center, in a semi-basement with brick walls covered in artificial ivy and soft, muted light creating a sense of coziness and safety. At a table in the far corner, away from the entrance and other patrons, sat a man Regina didn't recognize at first. Igor Bronikov, Anton's friend from student days, the witness at their wedding, the one who gave a toast to the newlyweds and wished them as much happiness as there are stars in the sky. He stood to meet her, and his face showed such a mix of guilt and sympathy that Regina's knees buckled again. Sit, he said, pulling out a chair and helping her sit. You need to sit before I say what I have to say. What happened? Her voice broke into a rasp. Igor, what's going on? Why are you here? How do you know this man? He glanced at Gennady Pavlovich, rubbed his face with his palms, trying to gather his thoughts, and exhaled. Regina, Anton didn't die. He's alive. The cup of tea she had just picked up to warm her frozen fingers slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor, scattering shards across the tiles and spilling brown liquid everywhere. Regina stared at Igor, not understanding the meaning of the words, unable to connect them into a coherent sentence because those 3 words contradicted everything she had endured in the last weeks. What? What did you say? He's alive, Igor repeated, leaning toward her across the table. The accident was staged. He's in hiding. For the next hour, Regina listened without interrupting, absorbing every word. Igor told about the debts, 42 million rubles, a fraudulent partner who fled with investors' money, creditors from criminal structures, threats to the family by phone, notes under the windshield wipers. Anton decided that the dead don't owe debts, that this way he'd protect his wife and child from people who wouldn't stop at anything. It was temporary. Wait 6 months, a year, until things settled, earn money somewhere on the side under a false name, return and start over. But why didn't he tell me? Regina whispered, and there was so much pain in her voice that Igor looked away. Why leave me alone thinking he was dead? Because his mother convinced him it would be safer that way, he replied with bitterness. That if you knew, you'd slip up accidentally, and then they'd find you both. She said she'd take care of you. Margarita Stepanovna knew all this time? Knew and stayed silent? Igor, she threw me out. Threw money on the floor and told me to get rid of the child. Said she didn't need a grandson. Igor's face went pale. What? She. God, Regina, I didn't know. Anton asked me not to show up, said his mother would take care of you, that she could be trusted. I thought. He fell silent, clenched his fists, and rage flashed in his eyes. This was entirely her idea. Anton knows nothing about this. She didn't just know. Igor's voice grew heavier, duller. She planned it all. She exaggerated the danger, painted pictures for Anton that would make anyone's blood run cold, that these people wouldn't stop at anything, that you and the future child would be in mortal danger. She convinced him to disappear completely, to cut off all contact. Regina sat motionless, digesting what she heard, and everything she thought was true crumbled to dust again. The woman who cried over her in the hospital, whom she considered an ally in grief, to whom she was grateful for support, all this time knew her son was alive. Her cruelty wasn't a reaction to loss, wasn't madness from grief. She had a cold, calculated plan built in advance. Why? Regina forced out through her parched throat. Why does she need this? She never accepted you, Igor replied, and disgust rang in his voice. A bumpkin without education, without connections, without a penny to her name. That's what she called you behind your back. The child for her is a burden that would tie Anton to you forever, not let him come to his senses and find someone worthy. She wanted him to marry her friend's daughter, the owner of a pharmacy chain. Imagine. A worthy match, a worthy family, not some village kindergarten teacher. The tears had run out, all to the last drop. Inside remained only emptiness and something heavy, dense, dark, rage or disgust or both fused into one unbearable lump. That same night, Regina ended up in a rented studio on the outskirts of the city, in an old 9-story building with an echoing entrance and a creaky elevator. Igor explained that Anton had prepared this place in advance, in case something went wrong, paying rent for 3 months ahead, 18,000 rubles a month for a tiny apartment with a view of the industrial zone, but safe and unremarkable. There she also received an old phone, a backup that Anton used for contact with Igor before his disappearance. He asked to give it to you if something bad happened to you, Igor said in farewell, already standing in the doorway. The data seems deleted, but try to figure it out. Anton was always cautious. From institute days, Anton had the habit of recording important conversations, first for work, then just out of inertia. Engineering paranoia, he laughed once. Regina hadn't paid attention to it then, but now this habit could save her life. She unlocked the phone with the password of the expected due date. June 27th. That Anton chose exactly this date made her heart clench with pain and tenderness at once. On the screen appeared a hidden folder for Regina, protected by another password, and she entered her name in Latin as he always wrote in messages. The folder opened, revealing a dozen audio files ordered by date. The first recordings were almost innocent. Anton's conversations with his mother about the plan details, how to best organize it, how to make the staging convincing. But with each subsequent recording, her mother-in-law's tone became harsher, scarier, more insistent. Do you want them to find your Regina? For something to happen to the child? These people won't stop at anything, Antosha, you understand. Her voice on the recording was full of fake horror, theatrical, contrived, and Regina physically felt how this lie, drop by drop, poisoned her husband's consciousness, forcing him to make decisions he'd regret for life. Then there was the penultimate recording, made the day before the accident. 3 voices. Anton, his mother-in-law, and some unfamiliar man with a low, confident voice speaking with businesslike calm, as if discussing the weather or gas prices. Don't worry, sister, everything's handled. When he drives the serpentine, the brakes will fail. Clean, no traces. Somewhere in the mountains, common thing, no one will dig. On the recording, Anton's voice sounded alarmed. Wait, what about the driver? Calm as, he'll suffer. Don't worry, nephew, the man replied. The driver's our guy. Everything's handled. Staging like clockwork. And then, on the same recording, after Anton left the room, his footsteps and the door heard, his mother-in-law's voice changed. Good, Margarita Stepanovna replied in the same mundane tone. Make sure everything's neat. And with his bumpkin and her pregnancy, I'll handle it myself. The phone fell from Regina's hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. She barely made it to the toilet before vomiting violently. Long, to bile. Brakes will fail. This wasn't staging, this was a conspiracy for murder. Margarita Stepanovna wanted her own son to die for real, so she could get the insurance, sell the apartment, get rid of the unwanted daughter-in-law and unwanted grandson in one fell swoop. Anton was in real, mortal danger, and he didn't know it himself. A week later, they left for Satkinskaya Kirilen. Regina, Igor, and Gennady Pavlovich, who broke away to accompany them as a doctor in case the pregnant woman felt ill on the road. Regina remembered how Anton told about the old believer Skeet in the mountains near Zaryadka, a house where his grandmother on his mother's side lived. He loved recalling childhood trips there. The smell of pine resin and fresh milk, the silence where only birds and wind could be heard. If we ever get tired of this mess, We'll go there. No cell service, no bosses, no creditors, just forest and sky. Her belly was already noticeably rounded, 4.5 months, and Igor tried to dissuade her from the trip, giving dozens of reasonable arguments, but Regina was adamant. Even if I have to crawl, I'll get there. He needs to know the truth about his mother, needs to know she wanted to kill him. The journey took almost a day. First on the highway to Satka, then on bumpy back roads where the car shook so much that Regina clutched the door handle and prayed silently that everything would be okay, that the child would endure the shaking, that they'd make it in time. The last kilometers they walked through the forest pines closed overhead, creating a green twilight. Snow crunched underfoot and sank knee-deep in places where animals hadn't trampled it, and with each step Regina felt her strength leaving her exhausted body. Gennady Pavlovich walked beside her, carrying her bag on his shoulder, constantly asking if she was tired, if she needed to rest, offering a break every half hour. His care seemed sincere, and Regina was grateful to him for this support, for being there in the scariest moment of her life, for not abandoning her when he could have just turned away and forgotten about someone else's problems. The child kicked inside her, strongly, insistently, responding to the mother's anxiety, and she placed her palm on her belly, calming him and herself. Soon, little one, she whispered, stopping to catch her breath. Soon we'll find Daddy. Igor walked ahead, blazing a trail in the deep snow, and his shoulders were slumped, his back hunched under the weight of the guilt he carried silently. Guilt for not recognizing Margarita Stepanovna's true face earlier, for not warning Anton, for allowing all this to happen when he could have intervened, could have asked the right questions, could have doubted. Regina saw his torment in how he walked heavily, mechanically, but she couldn't say anything in consolation because she herself was at the limit of her strength, driven by maternal instinct and love, that same love that made her get up from the floor of the rented apartment after the terrible recording, to go forward when it would be easier to give up, to lie down and not get up. The forest parted unexpectedly, and ahead appeared a clearing with several wooden houses, blackened with time, squat with narrow windows. Smoke rose from the chimney pipes over the roofs, ascending into the grey winter sky in thin columns. The elder came out to meet them. Tall, thin, with a long beard descending almost to his waist, in a black cassock and felt-lined boots. He stopped on the porch of the house, leaning on a juniper staff polished by years to a dark shine. "Peace to you, travellers," he said quietly, examining them with the calm curiosity of people accustomed to solitude and expecting nothing from the world but silence. "What do you seek in our wilderness?" "We are looking for a man," Regina replied, feeling her throat tighten with excitement, and the words came out hoarse, cracked. "Anton Rusin. I'm his wife." The elder shook his head slowly, with regret. "I don't know such a one. Here are only brothers and novices. We don't keep worldly people, it's not allowed by the rule." The hope that had kept Regina on her feet all these kilometers through the snowy forest began to melt, dissolving in the frosty air. But then from around the corner of the house appeared a young novice in the same black garb, and bowing to the elder, he quietly said, "Father, what about the guest from the distant Kira?" He asked to tell everyone that no strangers are here, ordered to keep silent about himself. "What guest?" The elder frowned, and the wrinkles on his forehead deepened. "You're not looking for Anton," came Gennady Pavlovich's voice from behind, and Regina turned, feeling everything inside turn to ice from this new, unfamiliar tone, in which there was not a drop of the warmth she had grown accustomed to over the last weeks. "Don't bother, he's not here and never was." The man standing before her was not at all the kind doctor she knew. Gone was the reassuring smile, gone was the warmth in his gaze, and his eyes looked cold, mockingly, with the superiority of a victor who had finally removed the mask worn too long. "This place is a trap," he continued, shoving his hands into the pockets of his expensive jacket and rocking from heel to toe like a man pleased with himself and his plan. "Especially for you, Regina. You clung so touchingly to your last hope that it would be a sin not to use it." "Chernik, what are you talking about?" Igor stepped forward, shielding Regina with his body. "You were his father's acquaintance, a partner. Why all this?" Gennady Pavlovich laughed dryly, without mirth. "Ah, Igor, who fell for the decades-old partner I've hated their whole family for 30 years, boy, and finally waited for my hour." He told the story unhurriedly, with pleasure, savoring every word, while 4 burly men in dark jackets emerged from behind the trees onto the clearing. About the partnership with Anton's father in the wild 90s, when they together created a notary office and both were in love with one woman, young Margarita. She chose not Gennady, married his partner, gave birth to Anton. Then came the betrayal. Falsified documents, a setup, a sentence Gennady served for nothing. Double betrayal in love and business. For 30 years, he prepared revenge. After her husband's death, Margarita Stepanovna was left alone, dissatisfied with her son's marriage to a bumpkin. He approached her, played on her greed and contempt for her daughter-in-law, taught her to manipulate Anton, helped organize the staging that was supposed to become a real death. She thought she was smart, Gennady smirked, and there was so much contempt in that smirk that Regina shuddered. But she was just a pawn in my game. Like you, girl. Igor lunged at the nearest of Chernika's men, knocking him down with a punch to the jaw, but the second jumped from behind and hit him with something heavy on the back of the head, and Igor fell to the snow without a sound, arm sprawled. Regina was grabbed by the arms by two others, twisting them behind her back, and Gennady pulled a syringe from his pocket, holding it to the light and examining the clear liquid inside. Calm down. A second, and all problems will end. Yours and that mishap inside you. Regina bit the hand holding her with all her might, to blood, tasting the salty flavor on her tongue, broke free from the weakened grip, and ran to the chapel, screaming for help, not watching her path, sinking knee-deep in snow. They caught up with her at the very doors, grabbed her by the shoulders, but between her and the pursuers stood the elder, holding out his staff before him. This is a holy place, his voice thundered across the skeet, echoing off the house walls. There's no place for evil deeds here. While Gennady argued with the elder, demanding he step aside and not interfere in others' affairs, Regina fumbled in her pocket for Anton's phone and turned on the recording. Let at least something remain. If she doesn't survive, let the truth not die with her. And then in the distance, beyond the forest, came the sound of engines. Blue flashing lights flickered between the black pine trunks. Gennady paled, retreating to the edge of the clearing. Let's go, quick. He and his men vanished into the forest, dissolving among the trees before the first police car burst onto the clearing, scattering snow from under its wheels. Then there were long weeks of waiting. They searched for Gennady throughout the region, but he vanished. Regina lived in the same rented apartment under the guard of two taciturn officers, not knowing if her husband was alive and where to look for him. The police arrived at the skeet thanks to an anonymous call. Someone reported a murder being prepared, gave exact coordinates, but the caller's identity remained a mystery no one could solve. The call from the hospital in Zlatrust came a week after the events at the skeet, early in the morning when Regina was still asleep. A patient with amnesia, a victim of a road accident, no documents, doesn't remember who he is or where he's from. The only mark. A long scar on his left arm near the elbow, old, long-healed. Regina would recognize that scar out of 1,000. Anton got it in his student days, falling off a friend's motorcycle on wet asphalt, and he loved joking that it was his battle wound, his distinguishing mark. She rushed to Zlatrust that same day, accompanied by police, her heart pounding so loud she feared the doctors would hear it. When she entered the ward, it clenched with pain and joy at once. On the bed lay her husband, emaciated, with a bandaged head, pale with sunken cheeks, but alive, breathing, real. Anton, she called, approaching on unsteady legs. Antosha, it's me, Regina. He slowly turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with an empty, unfamiliar gaze, in which there was no recognition, no warmth, no love she was used to seeing. Sorry, and who are you? Regina came to him from Chelyabinsk every other day, sometimes more often, despite the distance and fatigue, telling their story. About the bird cherry in April, about the children at the kindergarten fence who crowded the railing staring at the stranger, about his confused face when he asked for directions and didn't want to leave, about the wedding where her mom cried and her father called him son, about the joy of the pregnancy news, about his hands on her belly. Anton listened silently, sometimes writing something in a notebook the doctors gave him for memory recovery, and his gaze remained lost, empty, but sometimes a shadow flickered in it, a trace of memory, a glimmer of something familiar, and then Regina talked more, and more. Was I a bad husband? He asked once, and these were the first words in which he connected himself to the person from her stories, acknowledged himself as the Anton she loved. And then, after 6 weeks, the memory returned all at once, terribly, painfully, like a lightning strike. Anton clutched his head mid-conversation, groaned, and began muttering through clenched teeth. Karmaz, Serpentine, Chernik, Mom. Then he looked at Regina with eyes full of horror and understanding. Regina, I remember everything. It wasn't an accident they wanted to kill me. For real, to death. He told about that day on the mountain road, about the uneasy premonition that wouldn't let go, about the route that didn't match the one his mother gave, about the SMS from an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Turn around, it's a trap. But it was too late. The Kamaz was already rushing from behind down the hill, and Anton only managed to wrench the wheel so the car fell into the ravine instead of under the truck's wheels. Who sent the warning? He didn't know. Couldn't remember. The SMS was from a prepaid SIM that couldn't be traced. Maybe one of the accomplices got scared. Maybe conscience awoke in the person who was supposed to organize the accident. Or maybe it was someone's mistake to Gennady Chernik that they'd never know. The investigation hit a dead end, and this secret remained unsolved. The police arrived at the skeet also thanks to an anonymous call. Someone reported a crime being prepared and gave exact coordinates. The caller spoke through a handkerchief, altering his voice, and hung up without waiting for questions. Major Lyubimov assumed it could have been one of the locals, a forester or hunter who noticed suspicious people in the forest. Or maybe again that unknown savior. Regina didn't know and decided not to guess. The main thing was they survived. Gennady Chernik escaped from custody a month after his arrest. Simulated a heart attack so convincingly that the prison doctors panicked, and accomplices attacked the convoy on the way to the hospital, pulled him from the car, and drove off in an unknown direction. Major Lyubimov from the investigative committee called Regina in the middle of the night, waking her with an alarming call. All witnesses are in danger. The hospital in Zlatorust is under enhanced guard. She needs to leave the city immediately. Hide. No, she replied, surprised at her own calm, her own firmness. I'll stay with my husband. Enough running. Anton, learning of the escape, silently squeezed her hand. He was still weak after the accident, could barely walk without support, but something new appeared in his eyes. Firm, resolute, something she hadn't seen before. Regina remembered details from the recording. Margarita Stepanovna and her brother mentioned old warehouses in the metallurgical district, an abandoned industrial zone where her late husband's office once was, where he went on business. She called Major Lyubimov at dawn, barely waiting for morning. The squad found Gennady Chernik exactly there, in a half-ruined building of a former office, among rusty machines and broken glass, with 3 accomplices warming themselves by a fire lit right on the concrete floor. They offered no resistance, too tired of running, too frozen, too aware that the game was over. Daniel was born at the end of June, right on time, healthy and strong, with Anton's eyes and Regina's nose. They named him after her grandfather, the beekeeper. The trial of Gennady Chernik and Margarita Stepanovna took place 2 months after the birth, in early autumn. Gennady Pavlovich Chernik got 18 years in a strict regime for attempted murder and organizing a criminal group. Margarita Stepanovna got 12 years for complicity. Learning at the trial who Gennady really was, she sobbed and screamed that she was used, that she didn't know, but that didn't remove her guilt for wanting to kill her own son. Her brother Vyacheslav got 14 years for organizing the road accident. Regina didn't go to the sentencing. She didn't want to see their faces, hear their voices. For her, it all ended the moment she first held her son and saw Anton's reflection in his eyes. They sold the apartment in Zhakar-Parkovaya, didn't want to stay there. Too much was tied to those walls, too much pain soaked into every corner, and bought a small 2-room on the other end of the city, in a quiet district near a park where birds sang in the mornings and dogs ran. Anton didn't return to the construction business, didn't want to deal with partners or investors anymore. With the remaining money, he opened a small workshop in the garage, making furniture from Ural wood to order. Tables, chairs, children's cribs. I want a simple life, he said, running a plane over pine boards and inhaling the smell of fresh shavings. With my own hands, honestly. Enough partners and investors for me. Enough big money and big problems. Regina got a job as a kindergarten teacher nearby. The circle closed, back to the beginning, only now she looked at other people's children with different eyes, a mother's eyes, and loved them even more. Igor often dropped by on weekends, became little Daniel's godfather, learned to change diapers and warm bottles, and Anton joked that he'd make a great father when he found his own Regina. One December evening, when Danilka was already a year and a half, they sat in the kitchen, the 3 of them. Anton, Regina, and the sleeping child in his father's arms, and watched the snow fall outside, covering the yard with a white blanket. Remember I talked about the skeet? Anton asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the window. That if we get tired of the mess, we'll go there where there's no service, no bosses, no creditors. I remember, Regina replied, moving closer and resting her head on his shoulder. It was foolish. No need to run anywhere. Everything we need is already here. She looked at her sleeping son, at her husband, at the snow outside, and thought she had come a long way from that naive girl from Kievsky who believed in fairy tales and poorly recognized lies. Now she knew the price of trust and the price of betrayal, knew how painful it is to lose and how scary to fight when it seems the whole world is against you. But she also knew something else. That love is stronger than fear, that justice is possible, that people can choose good even when it's easier to choose evil. Matvey chose to stop his father, she chose to fight, Anton chose to return, and they chose each other again and forever. I don't need to go anywhere, she said quietly, and in her voice was the confidence that wasn't there when she stood on the landing with a bag in her hands. Where you and Danilko are, that's my home, that's my peace. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the city with a white blanket, sweeping away the traces of the past. In the yellow light of the kitchen lamp, the three people, man, woman, and child, looked like those drawn on Christmas cards. Simple and happy, having survived their winter and finally awaiting their spring.